Brace yourself.
Few games are as difficult to classify as Alan Wake. For all of its familiarities and references, it stands as something unique, even from a developer that had already made daring moves in the gaming sphere. Remedy delivered an experience that took common ideas and contextualized them into something definitive. Alan Wake's most notable nuances were ones that never stemmed from an individual concept or mechanic, but the unity of them all. Once all of its ideas came together, it carved a niche for itself in a gaming generation that had become crowded and stale with its own trends. Regardless of Alan Wake's quality, it's definitely unique enough to be worth discussing, especially considering how the trends of its generation were omnipresent, even on its debut system alone. It continued to grab attention, even this far after launch, and that level of appeal was well-deserved. Sadly, due to expiring licenses for the music in the game's soundtrack, Alan Wake was delisted from digital storefronts. As far as the community knew, the game was done, and with development on a potential sequel being rejected, it seemed like the Alan Wake franchise was just as finished. It shocked me that Alan Wake was to be delisted, because I always considered it to be a pretty amazing game, so much so that back when I was in college, I wrote my final paper on it for my media criticism class. I found the narrative and the mechanics to gel together so well, keeping things suspenseful but properly paced. So with the Alan Wake franchise closing down, I wanted to look back on what made the game so fascinating, and why it's one of the most memorable experiences of its era. This is Remembering Alan Wake. Leading up to playing Alan Wake, I never really had much experience with Remedy's work. The Max Payne series was never on my radar, so I went into Alan Wake with no precognitions with Remedy's strengths or weaknesses. I read the reviews, which were quite glowing, but I was in the dark on what to expect, no pun intended. My initial playthrough of Alan Wake lasted about 10 hours, and while I didn't complete it to 100%, I was fascinated enough with its eerie story and accessible gameplay. Over time, Alan Wake built itself up in my mind, so much so that I purchased both DLC episodes on Xbox 360. When everything came together, Alan Wake was very memorable to me, which is why I decided to write about it in that final paper. But it's been a while since my college years, and in retrospect, a lot of my initial experience was misinterpreted. The fact of the matter is that Alan Wake isn't as great as I thought it was back in the day. The game was trapped between some of the most underwhelming gameplay tropes of its generation. Derivative third-person shooting, shamelessly linear level design, photorealistic graphics that haven't aged well, mandatory unskippable walking segments. Pretty much everything that the community loathed about the 7th generation of consoles was somewhere in Alan Wake. It also didn't help that the combat felt sloppy. The dodge move was a notorious sore spot for me, which made Alan awkwardly hunch over as if he's either tripping or about to throw up. The generous aiming range is appreciated, but I routinely found myself stumbling through some of the most heated battles because of how awkward dodging felt. I also found its constant references to other similar media to be a bit too on the nose to seem like mere tips of the hat. Stephen King, Twin Peaks, The Twilight Zone, they're all there in totally shameless condition. Some scenes are copy-pasted right from their original source material, and Alan even explicitly name-drops those sources.
Stucky would be knocking on the door with his axe like Nicholson in The Shining.
It's jarring and makes Alan Wake look so much more like an imitator. While I actually found the Night Springs TV shows to be pretty interesting, so many other scenes and dialogue sequences act like fanboyish references instead of something that aims to build on those references. But for all these shortcomings, I still find Alan Wake to be worth playing. For a game with such a budget and financial push, the game feels like a cult classic. It has a roughness and mystique that's difficult to duplicate, whether in its generation or not. The story of Alan Wake trying to unravel the mystery behind his wife's disappearance in the enigmatic town of Bright Falls is presented with endless reverence toward the work of David Lynch, Stephen King, and Stanley Kubrick. As much as I hammered the game's textbook references to these figures' work, I would be foolish to ignore how successfully Bright Falls is presented to create the same mood as in any of those men's work. That's where Alan Wake's story really is at its best, creating a brooding, omnipresent sense of discomfort. Very much like Lynch and King, Remedy craft Alan's tale with formless phenomena, The dark presence is the danger, but a name as nebulous as that is a cornerstone to some of the most terrifying media of all time. Shapeless, all-seeing threats that influence our world and the people in it are what have made media like The Shining so gripping. And Alan Wake seizes the player's sensitivities like a hawk clutching its prey. It's not a villain or a mastermind, it's a thing, an it, that lives through darkness, and its only goal is to devour whatever light it can find. The battle between dark and light never disappears in Alan Wake's world, standing as the true conflict of the story, but any media can use this as a theme. In games, however, there's a higher standard, one that Alan Wake achieves. It's the way it uses its gameplay to further build on its story and subject matter that's truly remarkable. Getting the player invested in the mystery of the narrative is something any great suspense story needs to do, and I think Alan Wake attains that state at every opportunity. In Alan Wake, the light is your weapon, as the enemies will swarm you until you use a light source to dispel their surrounding darkness. To eliminate the shadows, you can focus your flashlight beam on them or use items like emergency flares or flashbangs. In fact, light is not just a weapon, but a crucial asset to exploring the looming darkness that permeates Bright Falls. Light from street lamps act as safe zones to refill health, hidden messages can be illuminated with your flashlight, leading to additional secrets, and destinations in the distance shine to show you where to go next. Darkness and light are extremely applicable when it comes to game level design because of their visual nature and binary state. It's easy for the player to understand where a safe zone is or where their destination needs to be when light is the main telegraph. It's not just the greatest challenger to the dark, it's a gameplay compass that constructs fluid player progression and easy to navigate level design. Being able to diverge from the beaten path even a little bit proves to have rewards as well, such as a hidden stock of ammunition or a coffee thermos, the latter being Alan Wake's token collectible that you can find throughout the game. The hidden case of supplies is especially potent, as you can hear heavy breathing when you approach them. But it's the manuscript pages that really give exploration its value. Discovering a manuscript page after making a short detour was exciting and gratifying all at once. In other games, these types of narrative bits are usually delivered through audio logs or items to examine, which I admittedly ignore most of the time in other games. But the way the manuscript pages deliver exposition non-linearly is brilliant. Sometimes you'll find a page about things that haven't happened yet, foreshadowing upcoming events and creating anticipation. It's a great way to build suspense while also cutting out the BS and keeping the pace lively, and it's a design device that I'd love to see more of in today's gaming ecosystem. Another amazing gameplay direction is how each page is set in the level. A player will usually find the pages on the main path, as they glow with a comforting light, but completing the manuscript entirely requires riskier behavior. Some pages are hidden deep in the shadows, far from the main path, so the player must risk a dangerous encounter in order to obtain them. Even more impressive is how the final few pages are locked behind the game's nightmare difficulty setting, which can only be unlocked after completing the game once before. This forces the player to fearlessly challenge stronger enemies in order to fully complete Alan's narrative. It's a simple but effective incentive to put players outside of their comfort zone, giving them the chance to find out every piece of the story, but not without taking a risk. While I have grown more critical of Alan Wake in my maturity, replaying it in 2017 revealed to me how well its storytelling and gameplay operate. They both retain their themes of light and darkness at war, while integrating these elements into player-friendly game design and a dynamic, suspenseful narrative. I do think that it has flaws, big ones, but no other game in its generation was able to take those familiar elements and give them this level of refreshment. Even in its most established gameplay tropes, Alan Wake dodges genre classifications so nimbly. For better or worse, it's one of a kind, and I'm sad that it has to go. It's a less than fitting end for a series like this, one that had limitless potential that will sadly go unfulfilled. The sun sets on Alan Wake, an experience like no other.